This is Ism. Season 1, The Origins of Socialism. Paris and the Making of Modern Revolution. Ideas meet power. Prologue. A doctor in Lyon. November 1831. Jean-Baptiste Montfaucon was glad his father had not lived to see this. As the young doctor stepped into the workshop, he was met by a chorus of wounds. An arm nearly severed at the shoulder, a leg blown off at the knee, an eye blackened with powder, a cheek pouring blood onto the warped wooden floor. He'd spent years tending to these same workers, dressing their cuts, setting their fingers after accidents with the looms. But this was different. It was as if the machines had turned on their masters, compressing years of industrial injury into one single deliberate act of violence. Not knowing where to begin, Montfaucon simply knelt beside the nearest body. He sewed shut the torn neck of a woman who looked to be his age, though years in the silk workshops had made her seem a generation older. She stood out not only for being one of the few women among the wounded, but also for her hat, a red cap, revolutionary red, as if she had stepped out of a different century. As he worked, the woman spoke. She told him how the workers had shut down their looms after the silk manufacturers refused to honor the wage minimums agreed upon by the city. They had gone through official channels, she insisted. They had trusted the municipal government. But when it became clear that no justice was coming, they rose. Montfaucon nodded. He already knew the outlines. He had followed the negotiations closely. His father had been a silk weaver too, but back then it had still been possible to rise by skill and reputation, from apprentice to journeyman, from journeyman to master. His father had died owning over a dozen looms and employing several apprentices. A rare story now. Since then, Montfaucon had tried to maintain his ties to the workshops, but the weavers had changed. At least something in them had. Outsiders perhaps wouldn't notice, but he had grown up at the sight of a loom. He saw it in their shoulders, their eyes, that same pride, but something harder now, more brittle, more desperate. He had documented the decline himself in socially conscious journals. Wages cut in half, rents rising, food prices spiking. He could not stop it, but he could observe, and he could help, if only with a needle and thread. The next day, the city ministers asked Montfaucon to serve as a neutral envoy. The rebels were holed up on Croix-Rousse Hill, the heart of Lyon's silk-weaving district. He had agreed. As he climbed the steep streets, he was struck by the silence. Just days ago, this neighborhood had pulsed with the rhythm of jacquard looms. Now, nothing. No sound but the wind between rooftops. A torn black flag flapped in the distance. Blood marked the stones. Empty rifle casings and smashed gears littered the streets. The air hovered with smoke and iron. 3 quarters up the hill, he paused to catch his breath. Then, heavy footsteps. When he looked up from his knees, dozens of men had emerged, surrounding him. Gaunt weavers armed with rusted muskets, clubs, pikes, hatchets. He looked back at his pressed waistcoat and cursed himself for bringing his hunting rifle. "He's a merchant," someone shouted. "Let him pay for the others." Then fists rained down. Someone tore the proclamation from his hands, ripped it, spat on it, stomped it into the dirt. A hand seized him by the neck and threw him to the ground. His skull struck the cobblestone. This was it, he thought. But through the ringing in his ears, a voice cut through. "Wait, don't kill him. He's my doctor." The woman in the red cap hobbled forward. The others parted to let her through. She ordered them to inspect his weapon. The rifle was clean. No smoke, no powder. He had not fired it, and that was enough for them. A tangle of arms, muscle, and sweat lifted the doctor from the gutter, blood oozing from a fattened lip, blackness swelling his right eye. For a flicker, Montfaucon was a child once more, lifted onto his father's muscular shoulders. "I'm not dead," he thought, feet on the ground, hands throbbing, head spinning. "I'm alive." He looked up, and one of the weavers beckoned him forward. As the sun hung red in the sky behind them, they began the long ascent up the hill. Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to Ism. This is Paris, 1848, the Red Flag in Spring, Part 1, The Volcano. So, this was not 1848, the year of revolution. And this was not Paris, the city of revolution. It was nearly 2 decades earlier, in 1831, in the city of Lyon, where between 6,000 and 8,000 silk workers, the Canu, rose up in armed rebellion. The Canu revolts are often cited as among the first moments when industrial laborers took up arms not as subjects of a monarchy or members of a guild, but as a class, demanding fair wages and dignity for their labor. In other words, this was not just a local grievance. It signaled the arrival of industrial class conflict onto the world stage. During the uprising, the weavers fortified the hill, flew black flags, and fought under the banner, "Live working or die fighting." Karl Marx would later characterize the strikes in Lyon as the first clear-cut example of the emergent class war between the bourgeoisie and the working class. To Marx, the Canu were the earliest sign that the industrial age had birthed not just new machines, but a new antagonist, the modern proletariat. Within a week, 20,000 royal troops descended on Lyon and retook the city. The revolt was crushed. But the red cap, the black flag, the barricaded workshops, and above all, the refusal to accept starvation wages, all pointed forward. Forward to 1848. Forward to a fire that would spread across Europe, to Paris, Berlin, Milan, Vienna, Rome, Budapest, and beyond. The Canu of Lyon may not have called themselves socialists, but their uprising and the repression that followed revealed a growing chasm between capital and labor in industrial Europe. Over the next 2 decades, that chasm would widen, and by 1848, it would explode. Chapter 1. The Glorious Days. Charles X can no longer return to Paris. He has caused the blood of the people to flow, but the Republic would expose us to frightful divisions. The Duke of Orleans, Louis-Philippe, is a prince devoted to the cause of revolution. He awaits our will. Let us proclaim that will. For it is from the French people that he will hold the crown. The Orleanist Manifesto of Adolphe Thiers, July 1830. Just a year and a half before unrest broke out amongst the weavers of Lyon, Paris had been overtaken by a rapid-fire wave of revolutionary upheaval. In July 1830, King Charles X, the Bourbon monarch restored after Napoleon's fall, provoked national outrage by issuing a series of royal decrees. These so-called July ordinances dissolved the newly elected Chamber of Deputies, revoked the freedom of the press, and called for new elections under a sharply restricted electorate. Charles had grown increasingly alarmed by the radical tone in the chamber, and like many monarchs of his age, believed it was not only his right but his divine duty to override the people's will in the name of national order. But the July ordinances would go down as one of the great blunders of modern political history. Within a week of issuing the decree, Charles would be forced to abdicate, and within a month he was aboard a ship bound for England, where he would live out his final years in exile. The revolution that brought him down is often called the Three Glorious Days. From July 27th to the 29th, 1830, the Bourbon monarchy was swept away in a mass insurrection that marked the final rupture after decades of simmering resentment. The unrest began when journalists and liberal deputies signed a bold petition refusing to comply with press censorship. On July the 26th, they called openly for resistance. Printers played a key role. For them, the abolition of a free press wasn't just an abstract loss of liberty, it was a threat to their very livelihood. Workers in printing shops went on strike, and as had happened in the First French Revolution, an alliance began to form between the working classes and the liberal bourgeoisie. On July the 27th, thousands of Parisians joined the protests. That evening, clashes erupted between demonstrators and the royal guard. Dozens were killed. The violence only radicalized the movement. Shouts rang out. Death to the ministers, down with the aristocrats, down with the king, to the guillotine. Paving stones, flower pots, and roof tiles were hurled at soldiers. Gas lamps were torn down and repurposed as weapons. Barricades began rising across the city, with the greatest concentration in working-class neighborhoods like the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. By some estimates, nearly 4,000 barricades were constructed, choking the narrow streets, disrupting troop movements, and signaling that the city itself had turned against the monarchy. By July the 28th, insurgents had seized the Hôtel de Ville, historic seat of the 1793 Paris Commune. The next day, they took the Tuileries Palace and the Louvre. By July 30th, royal power in Paris had collapsed entirely. And in the wake of that collapse, as barricades still smoldered and crowds roamed the streets, a new political order quickly began to take shape. Though the most powerful figures were not the street fighters or radicals, but the moderate liberals from the now deposed Chamber of Deputies. At the center of the action stood a 33-year-old political upstart named Adolphe Thiers. Perhaps no single figure better embodies the defining tension of the 19th century between working-class radicals and bourgeois liberals than Thiers. He would remain a central figure in French politics for the next 4 decades. And throughout his career, he consistently fought against royal despotism while also crushing popular uprisings that he deemed too radical. In 1832, 1839, 1848, and again in 1871, Thiers played a role in putting down working-class revolts. Again and again, he chose order over revolution, provided that order served liberal property interests. Thiers began his career not as a politician, but as a journalist and historian. He rose to prominence in the 1820s with the publication of his multi-volume History of the French Revolution, a widely read and at the time widely controversial work, published under the Bourbon monarchy. Simply treating the revolution as anything less than a catastrophe was, in itself, an act of defiance. But Thiers' history made a careful distinction. He portrayed the early revolution of 1789, with its liberal constitutional reforms, as noble and legitimate, but the more radical phase of 1793, with its social egalitarianism and Jacobin dictatorship, was viewed through the lens of the Reign of Terror and was condemned as a descent into terror, anarchy, and mob rule. In this way, Thiers helped to reframe the revolution in the popular imagination, not as a single sweeping event, but as a divided story, one half glorious, the other shameful. A triumph of the liberal bourgeoisie that had been hijacked by the proletarian mob. The July Revolution of 1830 marked Adolphe Thiers' entrance onto the political stage. As street fighting raged, Thiers worked behind the scenes to steer the revolution toward his preferred outcome, an orderly constitutional monarchy. So when the dust settled, the people were not granted a republic. Instead, they were handed a new monarch, King Louis Philippe. One of the wealthiest men in France, Louis Philippe would soon be dubbed the bourgeois king, backed by bankers, financiers, and railroad magnates. At the dawn of his reign, the liberal banker Jacques Lafitte famously declared, "From now on, the bankers will rule." The new regime, a constitutional monarchy draped in liberal rhetoric, offered little to the working class. Power had shifted, but it had not democratized. The right to vote remained tied to property ownership. The poor remained voiceless. François Guizot, the conservative liberal who, alongside Thiers, would come to define the July monarchy's political ethos, summed it up with a single phrase: "Enrichez-vous," enrich yourselves. Guizot's words were directed at those shut out of the political process, because, under the new rules, only men over 25 who paid a substantial amount in direct taxes were allowed to vote. The electorate, even after the revolution, expanded only slightly, from roughly 0.3% under the Bourbons to about 1% of the population under Louis Philippe. In short, only the wealthiest men in France were given a say in government. For radicals, Republicans, women, and the working poor, those who had just fought and died in the barricades during the Three Glorious Days, this was not a revolution fulfilled. It was a revolution betrayed. So this was the world in which the weavers of Lyon rose up in November 1831. Their rebellion, the Canu Revolt, was met with brutal force by the newly empowered July monarchy. And in a move that foreshadowed the tactics a much older Adolphe Thiers would use decades later against the Paris Commune, the government ordered the army to encircle Lyon and then to crush the insurrection with overwhelming violence. The barricades of July had barely cooled before the guns were turned on the very people who had built them. The message was clear. The new regime would not tolerate any challenge from below. And just months later, unrest would erupt once again, this time in the heart of Paris. Chapter 2. The Mask of Night. A quote from Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. There are accepted revolutions, revolutions which are called revolutions. There are refused revolutions, which are called riots. Interlude: The Man in the Attic. Fat raindrops hammered on the roof above Auguste Blanqui's head like a volley of bullets. Most people saw the attics of Paris as identical: dark, cramped, forgettable. But to Blanqui, each was a battlefield in waiting. Solid roofs to block the rain, sealed walls to keep out the rats and the informants. Deep corners to store rifles, knives, and ammunition. And most importantly, a window with an unobstructed view down the road to spot the ambush before it came. He didn't know how long they'd been hiding out there. Weeks, months, it didn't really matter. The nights all bled together. Time wasn't kept by clocks anymore, but by the number of cigars burned down to the nub. The cups of bitter coffee passed between comrades. Nights of endless planning, endless debate, but Blanqui knew tonight was different. He could feel it. For 2 years they had prepared. They had learned the lessons of 1832. They were no longer students or dreamers. They were men of action now. "Let's go over it again, Auguste." Blanqui didn't turn. That voice, Barbet's voice, had grown grating these past few months. Not because it was loud, but because it was uncertain. "It's all in place, Armand," he said tersely. "We don't need to go over anything. Now is when we act." "But what if we're not strong enough?" Barbet's voice cracked. "What if we're sending boys to die for nothing, again?" Blanqui crouched beneath the low rafters and began inspecting the rifles. Behind him glowed a portrait of Jean-Paul Marat dying in his tub. Blanqui's fingers moved with care, almost ritual. He did not look up. "You've been away for too long. You've forgotten what it's like. When the time comes, there won't be room for this hesitation. Get it together." "I just think we need more time," Barbet said, stepping closer. "We've built the society, yes, but with a few hundred men, we'll be crushed by the guard. Guizot will have us in chains by dawn." Blanqui paused. He stared down the sight of a rifle, then set it aside. "I'm not worried about my own life, Armand. And you've read Babeuf. You know what Thermidor taught us. Revolutions don't fail for lack of numbers. They fail for lack of resolve. The society has that now. When we strike, the people will follow. They've been beaten down too many times. Now they will only respond to action." Barbet did not answer at first. He looked out the narrow window at the empty, rain-slick street below. "I wonder," he said finally, "if we're doing this for them or for ourselves." Blanqui stood. "For them," he said, strapping on his belt, "because no one else will." Barbet remained at the window, silent. Behind him, Blanqui unfolded a red flag. Born in 1805, Auguste Blanqui came of age in a France haunted by the Revolution and ruled by men desperate to forget it. Raised in a middle-class home, he studied law and medicine, but from a young age he was consumed by a singular obsession: to overthrow the state and build a new social order. After the fall of Napoleon in 1815, the European powers, in a forced settlement, restored the Bourbon monarchy to France. The restoration was marked by reactionary backlash, as aristocratic émigrés who had fled in 1789 returned to Paris and set about turning back the clock. In this political environment, even moderate republicans and constitutional monarchies had to tread carefully. Radicals were arrested, reformers forced underground. And so a new generation of revolutionaries came of age in the shadows, trained not in parliaments or pamphlets, but in secret cells and codes and oaths. At the center of this conspiratorial world stood a new kind of figure, not the radical journalist or the elegant statesman, but the professional revolutionary. Gracchus Babeuf had been the prototype. Auguste Blanqui became its most radical manifestation. Blanqui thrived within this environment of secrecy and intrigue. Revolution became a vocation, his life a cycle of rebellion, prison, and exile. By his early 20s, Blanqui had joined the Italian Carbonari and thrown himself into conspiracies against the Bourbon monarchy. Then, when the people of Paris rose in the July Revolution of 1830, Auguste Blanqui fought on the barricades, one of many young militants who helped to bring down the Bourbon King Charles X. But when the dust settled, the people were handed not a republic, but a new monarch, Louis Philippe, the bourgeois king. As it became clear that this new regime was no less hostile to radical demands than the Bourbons, Blanqui and others began organizing in secret. In direct response to Louis Philippe's proclamation as King of the French, a coalition of students, artisans, and radical journalists founded a clandestine group, the Society of the Friends of the People. The name was a pointed reference to Jean-Paul Marat's revolutionary newspaper during the height of the First French Republic, signaling the group's ideological inheritance from the Jacobin tradition. But where the original Jacobins often operated publicly, in the press and in the streets, the new generation moved underground. Influenced by the Italian Carbonari and the conspiratorial legacy of Gracchus Babeuf, the society was built on secrecy, hierarchy, and discipline. The Society of the Friends of the People represented the crystallization of what would later be called Neo-Jacobinism, a revival of revolutionary republicanism shaped by defeat and repression. The key difference from their predecessors was their clandestine approach. Unlike Marat and Danton, who stirred the crowds with fiery speeches and public articles, figures like Blanqui and Armand Barbès operated from the shadows. They did not seek to ignite a spontaneous popular revolt. They sought to build a revolutionary vanguard, a disciplined force that would one day overthrow the state and implement radical social change on behalf of the people. Their opportunity came in June 1832. That spring, a cholera epidemic tore through the working-class neighborhoods of Paris. The urban poor had already been battered by years of poor harvests, food shortages, and rising bread prices, while wages remained stagnant. As thousands died in the overcrowded, unsanitary quarters of the faubourgs, the rich seemed to escape the worst. Rumors spread that the government had poisoned the wells. Public anger simmered just beneath the surface. Then, on June the 5th, during the funeral procession of General Jean-Maximilien Lamarck, a beloved Republican and fierce critic of the July monarchy, members of neo-Jacobin secret societies seized the moment. As the crowd passed through the heart of the city, they redirected it toward the Place de la Bastille, that symbolic epicenter of past revolutions. There, a red flag was raised, emblazoned with the words, "Liberty or Death." Once a symbol of unity, the tricolor flag had become tainted by its association with the bourgeois monarchy. The insurgents had now chosen a different banner, one they called back to the sans-culottes of 1793. But this time, the National Guard did not join them. Once the people's ally in 1789 and 1830, the Guard now stood with the regime. Without its support, the rebels were isolated. For one night, around 3,000 insurgents seized control of key working-class districts, including the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the cradle of so many earlier uprisings. They built barricades, tight, tangled, and desperate, and waited. But the state was prepared. By dawn, 20,000 National Guardsmen and 40,000 regular troops were fanning out across the city, encircling the rebellion. On June the 6th, street fighting raged. The barricades held for hours, but the numbers were overwhelming. By the end of the day, the June Rebellion was crushed. Nearly 1,000 people were killed or wounded. The streets of Paris were quiet once again. But something had clearly shifted. The dream of a republic still lived, in secret societies, in prison cells, and increasingly in the workshops and factories of an industrializing France. Though short-lived, the June Rebellion would echo through public memory. Most famously, its story was reimagined by Victor Hugo in his sweeping novel Les Miserables. Hugo had witnessed both the euphoria of the July Revolution in 1830 and the bloody repression of 1832. Though he began gathering material for the novel in the 1830s, he would continue shaping it for decades, finally publishing it in 1862. Politically, Hugo supported Republican ideals, though he remained far more moderate than revolutionaries like Auguste Blanqui or Armand Barbès. In his retelling of 1832, Hugo may have romanticized the doomed uprising, but he did not dismiss it. He sympathized deeply with the working poor, those who had risen again and again, only to be betrayed by the powerful. In a passage channeling the voice of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the Parisian district that had fueled so many uprisings, Hugo wrote, quote, "What did they want? They wanted an end to oppression, an end to tyranny, an end to the sword, work for men, instruction for the child, social sweetness for the woman, liberty, equality, fraternity, bread for all, the idea for all, the Edenizing of the world. They seemed barbarians, and they were saviors. They demanded light with the mask of night." In the wake of the June Rebellion, radical Republicans returned to the shadows. The work of revolution again shifted underground. After his release from prison, Auguste Blanqui rejoined the world of clandestine politics. Alongside Armand Barbès, he founded a new secret organization, the Society of the Seasons, a revolutionary group built with military precision. Its internal structure mimicked the calendar: 7 members made a week, 4 weeks a month, 3 months a season, 4 seasons a year. By 1839, the society had assembled more than 3 years under this system. Nearly 1,000 members, workers, artisans, students, and veterans of the uprisings of 1830 and 1832. It was a revolutionary vanguard in the making. The society's radical egalitarianism and conspiratorial discipline closely resembled the League of the Just, another underground group with a more international membership but with a growing presence in Paris. Many members overlapped, and within a decade, the League would evolve into the Communist League, the organization that commissioned the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. This was a very small and tight-knit world. The Communist Manifesto was still 10 years away, but already the Society of the Seasons, egalitarian, secretive, and committed to insurrection, embodied many of its core principles. By 1839, the bourgeois king Louis Philippe's liberal monarchy had begun to look less like a people's government and more like a fortress of the wealthy. Voting still belonged almost exclusively to the rich. Strikes were suppressed, newspapers were shut down. The hope and promise of 1830 had curdled into bitterness and repression. Throughout the decade, opposition to the July monarchy settled into a familiar pattern as a divide opened up between revolutionaries in the streets and reformers in the Chamber of Deputies. Blanqui and Barbès plotted revolution in the shadows, while Adolphe Thiers weakened the monarchy from the podium, the implacable insurgents against the consummate reformer. Posing as a defender of liberty, Thiers thundered against royal excess and rose in popularity each time revolt shook the streets. So the more radicals bled, the higher Thiers seemed to climb. Then, on the night of May the 12th, 1839, the Society of the Seasons made its move. Small bands of conspirators gathered in the working-class neighborhoods of Faubourg Saint-Denis. They struck at key sites of power, assaulting the Palais de Justice and seizing the Hôtel de Ville, the symbolic heart of Parisian Revolution since 1792 and former home of the Paris Commune. There, they raised the red flag, and in an echo of 1792 and 93, Barbès proclaimed a new revolutionary government from the steps of the Hôtel de Ville. But the city did not rise with them. The workers watched, but they did not follow. The streets remained quiet. The conspirators were isolated. Government forces quickly surrounded the Hôtel de Ville, and after a brief firefight, the uprising was over. Nearly all of the leaders were killed, captured, or exiled. Blanqui and Barbès were arrested and sentenced to death. Their sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment, thanks in part to public pressure from figures like Victor Hugo, who, though no Blanquist, recognized the sincerity of their cause. From his prison cell, Blanqui became something more than a revolutionary. He became a symbol. To the radical left, he was the eternal insurgent, defiant, disciplined, and incorruptible. But the failure of 1839 left scars. During their imprisonment, Blanqui and Barbès, once close allies, grew apart. Barbès, the romantic Republican, blamed Blanqui's impatience and secrecy. Blanqui, the doctrinaire conspirator, saw Barbès as naive. Barbès still believed in the spontaneous uprising of the people. Blanqui had lost faith. For Blanqui and his followers, the Blanquists, the lessons of Thermidor and the failures of 1830, 1832, and now 1839 were clear. Revolution could no longer depend on the masses, while Barbès and other neo-Jacobins clung to the dream of civic virtue and popular revolt. Blanqui argued that in an age of surveillance and repression, only a hyper-disciplined vanguard could deliver the social republic the people deserved. Blanqui and Barbès had once fought side by side, but now their paths diverged. Not just personally, but ideologically. One still believed in the people. The other believed in the secret cell. One looked to the Republic, the other to the Revolution. And in that rift, we begin to see the outline of a larger transformation, a shift from the ideals of 1793 to the realities of class struggle, from revolutionary republicanism to revolutionary socialism. Where Barbès imagined the people rising to defend republican virtue, Blanqui imagined a disciplined few seizing power on their behalf. Barbès was the last echo of 1793. Blanqui was already thinking like a revolutionary socialist.
But unlike his contemporary Karl Marx, Blanqui believed that revolution could precede consciousness, that a small, disciplined force could seize power first and then awaken the people after. It was a vision of socialism forged not in theory, but in prison cells and attic rooms, sharpened by persistent defeat. In that belief, in that stubborn, uncompromising clarity, Blanqui stood as both a prophet and a warning for the revolution still to come. Because the revolutionary vanguard would not die with Blanqui. His ideas would echo far beyond Paris in the decades to come, inspiring later revolutionaries who would revive them, often in darker, more ruthless forms. The insurrections of 1832 and 1839 had both ended in failure. Yet each defeat cleared more space for bourgeois liberals like Adolphe Thiers to tighten their grip on power. So while radicals bled or rotted in prison, liberal politicians rose as an indirect result of the very uprisings they often condemned. This tension between insurgent radicals and bourgeois reformers would emerge as the defining fault line of the Revolution of 1848. But neither revolutionaries nor reformers had yet confronted the deeper crisis gathering around them. For by the 1840s, something more elemental was beginning to swell beneath these political struggles. Poverty was deepening, prices were rising, and for millions of Europeans, hunger was no longer a seasonal disaster. It was becoming a way of life. And so the volcano was beginning to heat from below. Chapter 3. No Room for Red. We are at this moment sleeping on a volcano. Beneath us, the ground is shaking. Do you not hear the earth trembling again in Europe? Can you not feel the gale of revolution which is approaching? Alexis de Tocqueville, addressing the French Chamber of Deputies, January the 29th, 1848. Phytophthora infestans is a microscopic mold that thrives in cool, damp environments. It spreads by wind, water, or on the surface of infected plants. Its favorite host is the potato. And once it takes hold, it spreads fast, leaving entire harvests rotting within days. The mold likely originated in central Mexico, but by the 1840s it had begun to travel. First recorded in the United States in 1843, it moved quickly through Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, Nova Scotia. Then, by way of a shipment of seed potatoes, it crossed the Atlantic. The journey took weeks. In the dark belly of a wooden ship, the mold lay dormant. When the cargo was unloaded in a Belgian port, the spores awoke. From there, the mold spread across Europe like wildfire, through Flanders, the Netherlands, Prussia, France, and England, and most fatefully it reached the fields of Scotland and Ireland, where the potato was not just a staple, but a lifeline. Potato blight is subtle at first. It begins with dark spots on the leaves, green, then brown, then black. Sometimes a white fuzz appears underneath. But by then, it's too late. Entire fields turn soft and foul-smelling, the potatoes collapsing into mush at the touch. Beginning in the summer of 1845, harvests across northern Europe failed. Belgium lost up to 90% of its crop. The following year, Scotland and Ireland lost just as much. The results were catastrophic. In Ireland, the Great Famine caused more than 1 million deaths and drove 2 million more to flee. Starving, dispossessed, and desperate, they scattered across Europe and North America. The Irish diaspora was born amidst this hunger. But Ireland was not alone. Death and starvation struck Belgium, Prussia, and France. In cities across Europe, bread prices soared, wages stagnated, and the number of paupers, those whose poverty left them completely dependent on charity or government assistance, multiplied. The 1840s came to be known as the Hungry 40s, a period of misery that sharpened every social divide. And while the poor suffered most, the crisis rippled upward. Economic depression struck the middle classes, credit dried up, small landholders defaulted, artisans and shopkeepers closed their doors. For many, poverty was no longer something they observed, it was something they felt creeping closer each day. Across the continent, political frustration deepened. The starving had nothing left to lose, the anxious middle classes began demanding reform, and even the elites grew fearful. In the face of famine, mass migration, and economic collapse, the old social order began to crack. On February the 21st, 1848, in a small print shop in London, a short political pamphlet was published. It opened, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." Its young authors, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, were at this point still largely unknown beyond their immediate circle of radical activists. But their sense of urgency was not unique. From London to Naples, everyone could feel it. A specter, a volcano, something was coming. Europe was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. That spark would be lit the very next day in Paris. On the morning of February the 22nd, 1848, crowds of workers and students surged into the streets of Paris. They had emerged when the government announced the banning of the political banquets scheduled for that day. For months, these public dinners had been the polite loophole of the opposition. Lavish meals where reformers toasted universal suffrage, often behind plates of roast fowl and glasses of fine brandy, with speeches coming between the courses. But now even that veneer of polite legality had been stripped away by the government, and the result was widespread outrage. The crowds marched on the Place de la Concorde, the symbolic heart of the July monarchy. At first, the municipal guard seemed unsure of what they were facing. The banquets were usually full of journalists and lawyers, not apprentices, seamstresses, and hungry artisans. So the outnumbered officers initially hesitated until reinforcements arrived. By midday, the municipal guard advanced on the crowd with raised batons, pushing the demonstrators back from the square. But instead of dispersing, the crowd simply spilled into the surrounding neighborhoods and narrowed streets of working-class Paris. There, the reaction was immediate. Chairs and tables were dragged into the road, carts overturned, cobblestones pried loose from the ground. The first barricades of 1848 did not come from a conspiratorial blueprint or a secret cell. They rose the way gnawing hunger turns into righteous anger. Sudden, irrepressible, and made from whatever the people could tear from the world around them. The Revolution of February 1848 would unfold much like the July Revolution of 1830. A provocation from above, 3 days of street fighting, and a monarchy rapidly collapsing under the weight of its own fear. In 1830, it was Charles X crushed by revolt and replaced with the bourgeois king. In 1848, it would be Louis Philippe's turn. And as in 1830, the people brought down a monarch, only to see power slide yet again toward the cautious liberals waiting in the wings. Revolt opened the door while men like Adolphe Thiers were always ready to walk through it. The first clashes broke out on the night of February the 22nd in the working-class neighborhoods as insurgents brawled with the municipal guard. By the next morning, crowds gathered before Prime Minister François Guizot's home shouting, "Down with Guizot, long live reform." The National Guard was then deployed. But in a pivotal moment echoing 1830 and even 1793, many guardsmen refused to fire and instead joined the demonstrators. That night brought disaster. On the Boulevard de Capucines, over 600 demonstrators crowded outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Troops, untrained in crowd control, were ordered to fix bayonets. A shot rang out, chaos followed, and more than 50 were killed, nearly 100 wounded. The dead were then carried through the streets on wagons. Workers and students marched behind them, torches raised. And then the city erupted. By dawn, more than 1,500 barricades had risen. Railroad tracks were torn up. Paris was now in open revolt. On February the 24th, the insurrection swept through the capital. The Hôtel de Ville fell within hours. The army retreated to the Tuileries. Amid the chaos, a now middle-aged Adolphe Thiers urged King Louis Philippe to flee and surround the city with regular troops, and then to crush the uprising from without. But the king refused. 13 years later, Thiers would use this exact strategy to destroy the Paris Commune of 1871. With options vanishing, Louis Philippe abdicated in favor of his grandson. He and the queen were quietly escorted out by cavalry. That afternoon, insurgents stormed the Tuileries, seized the king's throne, and dragged it to the Place de la Bastille. There, they scrawled on it, "The people of Paris to all Europe. Liberty, equality, fraternity." Then they set it ablaze. The next morning, February the 25th, poet and statesman Alphonse de Lamartine stood before a cheering crowd at the Hôtel de Ville and proclaimed the Second French Republic.
Interlude, a painting in the Tuileries. The date is February the 25th, 1848. The setting, the Hôtel de Ville. The smell of gunpowder hangs in the air. The barricades still stand, cobbled together from crates and furniture, blood wet on the stones beneath them. For 3 days, Paris had been in open revolt. Shopkeepers, students, seamstresses, nurses, masons, and printers had fought in the streets. Many had died for this moment. Now, a massive crowd filled the square outside the Hôtel de Ville, demanding a new kind of republic. Not one for the bankers and deputies, but one for the people. A social republic, a commune. They had come to seize the building, just as their grandparents had done in 1793. The crowd buzzed with memory and expectation. Then word spread. Alphonse de Lamartine was going to speak. A moderate, yes, but a respected one. A poet and a Republican. And standing behind him were Louis Blanc and Albert the Worker, socialists whose presence gave the crowd hope that this time they would not be betrayed. The noise dimmed to a hush as Lamartine climbed onto a green chair to be seen above the throng. His black coat clung tight to his slender frame, a tricolor sash at his waist. The Provisional Government of France, he announced, is the Republican government, and the nation shall be immediately called upon to ratify the resolution of the Provisional Government and the people of Paris. Cheers erupted. Vive la République rang out in a wave. But Lamartine raised a hand, sobering the moment. The Provisional Government, he repeated carefully, is for the Republic, subject to the ratification of the people who will be immediately consulted. The cheers faltered. Confusion rippled outward at this befuddling qualification. Some shouted again, but now the cry, "Proclaim the Republic," was no longer triumphant but insistent. Tension thickened. The crowd inched forward. Deputies whispered. A scuffle broke out on the far edge of the square. Then, from the back of a crowd came a strange hush. A ripple parting bodies like water. A woman on a great horse was making her way forward. She wore the rough blouse of a nurse and a long gray skirt. Her brown sleeves clung tight to her arms. On her head, a red Phrygian cap. In one hand, she held a short sword. In the other, a massive red flag bearing the words, "Vive la République." Gasps echoed. Marie, Marie of Lille. To some, she was a real woman. To others, a legend. A phantom of revolutions past. The nurse who had tended the wounded. The woman who had climbed the barricades, bullets missing her as if by providence. Some claimed to have seen her in July of 1830. Others swore she stood atop the Bastille in '89. Now, she came forward like an old memory summoned by the crowd itself. The white horse rose above the sea of people like a wave crusting on cobblestones. She locked eyes with Lamartine. He stood frozen, barely taller than her in the saddle. His voice returned, colder now. "The red flag," he said, "has only made the tour of the Champ de Mars, covered in the blood of the people." He glanced down at his sash. "The tricolor has made the tour of the world, with the name, the glory, and the liberty of the homeland." Silence. Then, "This republic stands for the people of France, but it rejects the red flag." A stillness swept the crowd. Cheers dissolved into murmurs. Anger smoldered. Some began to shout. Deputies moved to shield Lamartine. The insurrectionary commune, was it about to be reborn? But Marie answered. She removed her cap, lowered the flag, and turned the white horse. Slowly, she rode back into the crowd, and like a dream, she vanished. She would not be seen again, but those who were there would remember her, the woman who had brought the red flag to the gates of power and was turned away. Lamartine refusing the red flag in front of the Hôtel de Ville is a monumental painting by Henri Félix Emmanuel Falapeto. Completed just months after the February Revolution, it spans nearly 200 square feet and was exhibited in the Tuileries Palace as a defining image of what the new republic would stand for. The scene is bewildering, a chaotic tangle of bodies and banners, all motion and emotion. But the composition draws the eye deliberately from left to right. On the left, smoke, shadows, and a crowd that seems to surge out of the ruins. At its center, Marie de Lille rides a white horse holding the red flag aloft. She's surrounded by stylized figures, working-class caricatures, while in the foreground a glittering pile of loot lies conspicuously displayed. Silver, gold, ornamental trophies of monarchy, spoils of revolution. This crowd is meant to symbolize socialism, but not flatteringly. It is feminized through Marie Delille, yet also demonized. It is too soft and too hard, womanly and chaotic, dangerous and undisciplined. The message is not subtle. To the right, the tone shifts. The Hôtel de Ville rises clean and pale against the smoke. Well-dressed delegates of the assembly stand in orderly ranks, flanked by the National Guard. The few women present are buried in the crowd. Lamartine extends his arm, palm outward, refusing the red flag. Around him, others mimic the gesture, saluting not the people, but the restraint. The meaning was clear. This would be a moderate republic, not the radical republic of 1793, not the social republic imagined by the insurgents. Lamartine's refusal, his rejection of the red flag, was now canonized in oil and canvas. The new republic would wear the tricolor, not the crimson banner of gender equality and class war.
But February's volcano would not stay contained. The spring of 1848 would not only deliver constitutional reforms and expanded voting rights, it would also unleash a wave of popular pressure from below. The workers and students who had bled on the barricades refused to remain silent in the name of order. And because they could not be silenced, the provisional government was forced to make room for more than moderates like Lamartine or liberal conservatives like Adolphe Thiers. It had to admit socialists, neo-Jacobins, and even emerging anarchists, if only to keep the streets from rising again. And so, in our next episode, we will follow this uneasy coalition. Louis Blanc, the socialist reformer who believed the republic must guarantee work for all through state-sponsored national workshops designed to gradually replace private enterprise. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the printer-philosopher and first to call himself an anarchist, who rejected state-directed reform and argued for a new social order grounded in mutual aid and voluntary association. And of course, Auguste Blanqui, the uncompromising revolutionary whose life in prison had only sharpened his conviction that the republic must be won by the people themselves, not handed down from above. Then we will follow those whom the new republic refused to hear. Socialist feminists like Eugénie Niboyer, Flora Tristan, Claire de Mar, and Jeanne de Rennes. Women who asked why a revolution born in the name of the people barred half the people from citizenship. Their demand would test the republic more deeply than any barricade ever could. So join me for our next episode as we return to Paris 1848 to watch the red flag in spring catch fire.
Le gilet bien court, les tons desserrés, roulant sans vêtements, cueillis mon refrain du pendant de Cerise d'Hermont, elle rose appareil, tout bon sous les mous, sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien court, les dents de série.
ISM is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the ISM Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.